Okay, thanks, Gemma. As Gemma said, I'm a public service architect and an architectural educator. And what Tara asked me to talk about today was answering two questions. What do we mean by reciprocity in the communities and spaces in which we live? And how do we create spaces that adapt to our needs as we age? And to answer those questions, or to attempt to answer them, I'm going to talk a little bit about working to enable collaborative urbanism and participatory design of public spaces, and showing some images, unusually for an architect, of people rather than buildings, from enabling some of these processes in the last 7 years. In relation to public spaces, reciprocity to me means creating equity and balance in the use of our shared public resources. Mutual exchange of rights, privileges, but also our own obligations in terms of shaping our cities and public life. Some of the challenges that we face when designing public spaces are making them more adaptable enough to accommodate a huge variety of different needs and expectations, from space to store our cars, to communal outdoor living, to biodiversity, to plant life, and to accommodating a diverse set of users with different abilities and different ways of navigating the world. Designers are often asked to design in a vacuum, sort of speculatively or generically. And the solution is really to work with our more vulnerable users, young children, older people, people with mobility issues, sight or hearing difficulties, and different cognitive abilities. If you can design for those people, you can pretty much suit everyone. Collaborative and interdisciplinary arts and architecture practice can contribute to the solution, engaging with the key issues that impact on our right to cultural and creative lives in our public spaces. Architectural design techniques enable the co-design and co-production of the public realm. And those are really through two processes: analyzing the context in terms of what exists at the moment in our environment and our society, and then actively imagining how they could exist in the future. How could these things be organized differently? Meeting the needs of the community can only happen when citizens are engaged with the design process and with their government and decision makers from the very start. How can urban authorities facilitate ways in which citizens can help shape their cities and build confidence and know-how and collaborating with each other? One of these ways is designers of public space becoming sort of network weavers in a process in which they lead a group of people, diverse group of people, to look at the totality of urban life. And they can bring these groups through a kind of continuous process and an iterative process of placemaking, which starts with an initiative or an idea, or even a set of values, and moves through then a co-design process, a planning process, and I think importantly a sort of prototyping process, and then starts all over again. Citizen engagement is changing. In the old consultation model, citizens are typically invited to comment after key decision making has happened. And in collaborative urbanism, citizens are involved at the initial concept stage with incremental small-scale improvements which are trialed and tested before detailed designs are developed. This allows for a host of local actors to test new concepts before making substantial political and financial commitments. The key principles for cities to commit to collaborative urbanism approach include inspiring people to care for their community, often starting with collecting their stories. This is an example of an intergenerational design workshop that we held in Oranmore, where we put together the heritage group with both the primary and secondary students. And we involved them through kind of mapping their community and collecting stories about their place, really in a way of trying to build up a kind of character and identity of that place. They can also do this through hosting listening events, which provide opportunities for diverse opinions to be aired and to be heard. This is an example of one in Limerick that we did around the Riverway. And really just actually listening is an important part of the process. And by supporting safe and inclusive spaces for urban dialogue and exchange. This is an open crit that we held in Wood Quay, looking at how the public spaces might be used differently. Cities should commit to becoming listening organizations, creating authentic conversations and two-way relationships to gather local knowledge, ideas, and aspirations, to ensure that the design, as it develops, stays true to its core principles. identifying local priorities through community auditing and mapping. This is a Petracucha night in which people were asked to put forward their own aspirations and values for the place that they lived. And this is an example of a community mapping process in which we invited a number of different groups: the Access Group, the Purple Flag Group, which is concerned with sort of nighttime safety, the Irish Georgian Society, and the Friends of the Canal in Limerick. And what's really important about putting those people together is to see all of the various different kinds of aspirations that people have around their public space, and how sometimes they can be conflicting, and how can we together come forward with solutions for these. And I think making the city. So this is an example of a co-design workshop in which people can actually try to kind of test out things in kind of small-scale models. And then through prototyping and road testing solutions. This is a project that we did in Wood Quay maybe 2 years ago, in which we worked with the Fab Lab and the Urban Interaction Design Centre in UL to design a bench, which we installed in the public space. And that was designed through this kind of process. And what was interesting about that bench is that one of the issues that we found in Wood Quay is that there was an awful lot of older women living in Wood Quay. And a lot of them really became isolated in their homes, and they couldn't even get up to the local shop to get milk, because in order to walk the 200 yards, they needed to sit down on the way. So at the end of the bench, it's very high, so they could lean, but they could also they could easily get up. That was actually designed into it through that process where the designers understood what the requirements are. The other requirement was that it couldn't be too comfortable. People couldn't sit down there all night long and party all night long while the people were trying to live up above it. And it couldn't be picked up and thrown, so it had to be assembled in a way in which there were interlocking elements that allowed it not to be picked up and thrown. So there are all kinds of needs that went into this process, but understanding them really came out into the design, and this was a prototype solution. And I suppose the last thing to say is that we all have roles and responsibilities as designers, as public officials, but also as members of the community in the shaping of urban public life. And that shows the kind of processes that happened in Wood Quay, in which we had open crits actually in the space, and where it was very easy to understand the qualities of that space and how it worked. The men's shed, who helped to assemble that, who were trained through the Galway City Council's health and safety officer to do that properly without hurting themselves. The owner of the shop who offered the space in front. We had people. There was no budget for that project. It was donated through a local building supplies company. Donated the plywood and the materials for it, because they just had a kind of social consciousness part of their business and were willing to work. It was a very interesting process in doing that, because it was a sort of a negotiation. And we said, well, what can you give us? And they said, well, what do you want? And we said, well, how much can we have? And they said, well, how much do you need? And so it was very much an iterative process. But in the end, it came out of that process. And what we found is there was a huge amount of generosity in that space. So that was just one example. That was installed for 6 weeks. And actually what was really interesting about that process is that the conversation changed from, we can't have a bench in this space because it'll attract antisocial behavior, to after 6 weeks when we went to take it out saying, why are we taking it out? And I think that's what it's about. It's about changing the conversation and figuring out how we can work together to do it. So again, all of us have a role in shaping our public life, and how do we figure out ways to engage that? Thanks very much.